What's up, Restoration? Brian here. Hope you're having a great day. Hope things are going well for you right now. We are in the series of Bible stories, and you might notice something a little bit different here this day. I don't know if it's morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are and whenever you're listening to this, but I just wanted to say that it might look a little bit different than in weeks past because I don't have my trusty flannel board here, my flannel graph, right? I used it last week sparingly with Joseph and all of his coats of many colors and all of his brothers, and this week I was going to use it out. I was going to bring it out again. I was going to do it again, but then when it didn't seem right. It didn't seem like I wasn't going to use it for much. It was just going to be a prop. It was just going to be something that I had to set up and not use. I didn't have much with it with this story. There was a lot going on in Joseph's life, and to be able to go back to the board and come back here. So I just decided for a week, you know what? We're not going to use the flannel graph. We'll use our technology. We'll have all that kind of stuff, but we're not going to have the flannel graph. And so I hope that's okay with you. We'll bring it back next week. Don't you worry about a thing. We're going to be covering some people next week, and I don't remember what the schedule is, so I'm not going to say who we're covering next week because, honestly, I don't remember. But this week we're going over the second half of Joseph, and we're going to skim over like 13 chapters and kind of head to the end because that is the part that I want to get to. And I hope that you're okay with everything that happened last week with the sermon, with the message. I got some cool messages back. I got some cool responses. And we had a really great discussion on Sunday. If you're missing out on a Sunday morning and you want to hear more about what that is all about, well, good news. Come and check us out tomorrow. We're going to have a video here on Facebook and probably YouTube as well. On some stuff that we have coming up for Sunday morning. So you're going to want to take a look at that, and that's going to, like I said, that's going to be tomorrow. But we are in the book of Genesis, and we've been covering Joseph and everything that Joseph has been going through. When we last left Joseph, he was sold into slavery in Egypt. He was sold into slavery into Egypt, and that was in chapter 37. We had the Midianite traders, and he was sold into captivity with those guys. And so we're going to jump ahead. Chapter 38 is about his brother Judah and Tamar. That is a pretty messed up story. So if you want to read that, be my guest. It kind of takes like a little side road and talks about Judah for a while and Tamar and that whole messed up situation. It kind of reminded me, not the situation, but this part of the book, this chapter of, I was reading, what book was I reading? I was reading Sherlock Holmes. That's what it was. And one of the books I was reading, it went all Sherlock Holmes, all Sherlock Holmes, all Sherlock Holmes, and then just randomly went to people in the West, in the United States, and then went back to Sherlock Holmes, and it all tied it up nicely together. That's what I assume is happening in Genesis 38. And then we get to Genesis 39. We're just doing a quick recap, or I don't know how long this recap is going to take, but we're doing a recap. In Genesis 39, we have Joseph, who was in Potiphar's house. Now, Potiphar was a guy who worked for Pharaoh, and Joseph was Potiphar's slave. And Joseph was a pretty handy man. He had a lot of duties that he had to do in the house. And he goes into Potiphar's house, and he is working in there. Things are going well. But Potiphar's wife thought Joseph was a pretty good-looking fella, and she wanted to have relations with him. She wanted to have relations with Joseph, and I got to tell you, it did not end well for Joseph, because Joseph, a good man, an upstanding man, he declined the wife's advances, the Potiphar's wife advances, and it made her very upset. And so one day, Joseph was working, she was in the house, he was in the house alone with her, and she cornered him. and she tried to, sport with him, and he again refused to do so. So he fled the scene as quickly as he possibly could. But as he's leaving, she grabs his jacket, his coat, his robe, whatever it is that you want to call it, grabs it. He bolts out the door, leaving that behind. And so now she twists the story and says, oh, Joseph, he tried to rape me. He tried to do these things, which I know is very difficult to hear in times like these with the stand-up or the Time's Up and the Me Too era, all of that kind of stuff. There's accusations going all across the board, and we cannot take them lightly. But this is an instance where she claims something, it doesn't actually happen, and Joseph doesn't get to stand trial. He doesn't get to defend himself, and he gets thrown into prison. She told her husband that that Joseph did this to her, which, it was a lie. And so Potiphar was furious when he heard this. In verse 19, wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. And I love the next verse. In verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him his faithful love." Joseph became a favorite of the prison warden. He was able to have a whole bunch of jobs in prison. Everywhere Joseph went, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but everywhere that Joseph went, people liked him, except for his brothers, But the way that he treated people made a huge difference in the circumstances in Joseph's life. No matter where he found himself, no matter what he did, no matter how of a dreadful of a situation he found himself in, he always was able to carry himself in a manner that showed favor from the Lord. And so as we go about our business, as we go about life, we need to look at this and say, how am I treating other people around me? And I'm going to get way too far ahead, so I'm not going to do that anymore. So then we get to Genesis chapter 40. Joseph interprets two different dreams while he's in prison. There are two officials from Pharaoh. One of them was the captain of the guard, I think it was. Wait, let me look this up real quick. Oh, no, it wasn't. I'm an idiot. I'm stupid. I'm sorry. That's not what it was. It was the cupbearer and the baker. How could you get mad at the cupbearer and the baker? Well, Pharaoh got mad at the cupbearer and the baker, and each of them were thrown into prison. And so they each had a dream, and Joseph was able to interpret each dreams. And because that's what Joseph was able to do. Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph replied. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. So they tell him the dreams, and Joseph tells the cupbearer that he's going to get his old job back. And then he tells the baker, you're not going to make it. And that is precisely what happens. And Joseph says, before they leave prison, he says to the cupbearer, not to the baker, because the baker is, there's not going to be much room for him to do anything, really. And so he tells the cupbearer, he goes, hey, when you get out of here, because you're getting out of here before me, please, please, please tell Pharaoh about me. Tell Pharaoh about my situation. Please do this for me. And the cupbearer's like, yeah, I got you, bro. You and me. 2 full years later, Joseph's sitting in a jail cell still. The cupbearer got his job back. The baker is dead. They forgot about Joseph. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreams that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. But he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind, and these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. So Pharaoh's freaked out with these dreams, and he's got these dreams going on, and he doesn't know where to turn to. And he's telling about these dreams over dinner, with his friends, being like, hey, want to hear this crazy dream that I had? This was kind of freaking me out a little bit. And he's going around trying to tell all these people about his dreams, and the chief, the cupbearer, overhears him and says, I know what I forgot to do 2 years ago. And so the cupbearer proceeds to tell Pharaoh about this guy named Joseph, that he interpreted the dreams and it came true. And so they release Joseph from prison, and this is in chapter 41. They release Joseph from prison. He goes and interprets the dreams and said, hey, for 7 years, you're going to have plentiful. 7 years, it's going to be plentiful. And then you're going to have 7 years of famine. So in those 7 years of plenty, make sure that you store enough grain to take care of yourselves and everyone around you. If you do this, you're going to have storehouses of grain, all these big, huge buildings filled with grain and food and all the things that are going to last for 7 years, for this drought, for this time of not, for 7 years. And so they go and they have... He interprets this dream, and Pharaoh is very, very grateful. And Joseph is made ruler of Egypt. So he goes to prison for allegedly raping someone, which did not happen. And then he was in a pretty good position then, goes to prison, loses everything, but then goes to Pharaoh himself, and now is ruler over all of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Never mind. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for a second in command, and wherever Joseph went, the command shouted, kneel down. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And as predicted, so this is 41, we go ahead 7 years. As predicted, they've got 7 years of prosperity. Bumper crops every single year. And Joseph gets married and he has 2 kids. He's got 2 sons named Manasseh and Ephraim. And then at last, the 7 years of the bumper crops is over. And then the 7 years of famine begin. Just like Joseph predicted. And then we have chapter 42. So all of the land of Egypt, everywhere around, no matter where you went, there was famine in the land. People had nothing. But thankfully in Egypt, they listened to Joseph's command. They said, store up for 7 years and you'll have enough for the next 7 years. And so Joseph's brothers, way back in the land of Canaan, where Joseph's brothers are, the famine hits them. And Jacob hears that there's grain in Egypt. And he says, go to Egypt. Go there, please, and see if you can get some grain for us. So Joseph's brothers go to Egypt. And Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where are you from? He demanded. From the land of Canaan, they replied. We have come to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. So Joseph does this whole thing. He gives them grain, and then he plants some stuff in their bag that makes it look like they stole, so they had to come back. And then there was another little brother born, even younger than Joseph, Benjamin. And Joseph says, if you don't come back with Benjamin, you're going to be in trouble. So the brothers all go back and they say, we have to go back and we got to bring Benjamin with us. And Jacob is distraught over this because he doesn't want Benjamin to get lost. He had already lost Joseph, so he thought, and he doesn't want to lose Benjamin. And so Benjamin has to go back with them, and they all go back and they get more grain. And Joseph invites them in. And then again, he places something in there. Oh, the first time he put the money back in their bag, so it looks like they didn't pay. He comes back again. The brothers come back again, and this time they put silver in some silverware. Like that's. Did you know silverware actually comes from silver? Not anymore, unless you're super fancy, like in Egypt or something. But so the brothers come back. And Joseph has a feast with them. He has this whole feast with them, and he goes and he sends them away, and he puts silver in Benjamin's bag. And as they're leaving, the silver spills out. And it says, when the palace manager caught up with the men, he spoke to them as he had been instructed. What are you talking about? The brothers responded. We are your servants and would never do such a thing. See, they didn't know what was going on. Didn't we return the money we found in our sacks? We brought it all the way back from the land of Canaan. Why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? If you find his cup with any one of us, let that man die, and all the rest of us, my lord, will be your slaves. So they find the cup with Benjamin, and they are distraught. So then we go to verse 45, chapter 45. So they all have to go back. I know we're taking some time to paraphrase everything, but again, a lot happened in Joseph's life that we're not able to cover, but we need it for context, okay? So I'm trying to just blow right through this. All right, chapter 45, Joseph finally reveals his identity. And in verse 7, this is a part that I love. It says, God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you, and he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of the entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. So they have this great reunion, and then they invite Jacob, the father, the patriarch, and his family to come to Egypt. So Jacob comes to Egypt in chapter 46, he comes to Egypt. In chapter 47, Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Joseph becomes a very, very great leader during the famine time. And then it comes time for Jacob to die, because that's what people do when they get old. They die. Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim. Those are the two sons of Joseph, and that's a cute story where cute, I guess. It was the right hand was the proper thing, right? And I'm sorry for all you left-handed people, but the right hand was proper, the left hand was not. And so Jacob was becoming blind. It must be a hereditary thing, because if you remember, his dad, Isaac, was also blind at the end of his life. Anyway, so Jacob is going to bless Manasseh and Ephraim, or you can call it Ephraim. I don't know. I'm not Jewish. I don't know Hebrew that well. Okay, so sue me. Don't sue me, please, because I don't have that much money, and I'd have to give you my dogs or something. I wouldn't want to do that. Anyway, so Jacob, he's going to bless Manasseh and Ephraim, and as he does that, Joseph comes in, puts one child on each side of Jacob, because Jacob's old, and Jacob, in his blindness and oldness, does this. He wants his right hand on the younger brother and blesses the younger brother with the right hand, and on the left hand he blesses the older brother. But Joseph was upset, so he put his hand on the right hand on Ephraim's head, because he had put Joseph's hand. I'm sorry, let me start over. He had put Jacob's hand. Jacob put his own hand on Ephraim's head. That's what I'm trying to say. Joseph moves it over to Manasseh because he was the older. And Jacob says, no, this is exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. He says Manasseh will also become a great people, but his younger brother will become even greater, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations. So he gives this blessing. It's really not that important to the story, but I told you anyway. Jacob has his last words to his son. This is where he comes back and tells Reuben, hey, you slept with my concubine. I don't like you. And he has something mean, actually, kind of say to just about everyone. And Jacob dies, and Joseph is left with his brothers. And that, my friends, is where we pick up the story. So we've got this quick recap of Joseph's life. He had a lot of stuff happening to him. And when we look at our own lives, we wonder, what would our response be? When life treats us unfair, what would our response be? What would my response be to something that is unfair to me? And I don't have to think very hard about that, because I see unfair things happen to me in my own mind, happen to me all the time. In our own lives, we see unfair things happening to us day in and day out. I guarantee you. I mean, we can just look around at our country right now and see things that are going on and people responding over unfair and unjust things that have happened. But we don't get our example from the world. We get our example from Scripture, right? But we have our own opinions. We have our own things that we have to deal with. And however we deem something unfair, what is the response to that? Life is an unfair thing. We're going to come up into unfair things all the time. And so we are going to be tested in all of these things. Like when just the other night, I went, because nighttime is the best time for this, I went to go get a bowl of cereal because I love cereal. especially nighttime cereal. It's the best bedtime snack, and you cannot tell me that that's not true. If you eat cereal in the morning time, you're a weird person, and I don't know if you know anything. So there, battle line drawn. What do you think about that? So I'm a nighttime cereal eater, and I get the bowl ready, I get the cereal ready, I got the spoon, I'm mentally prepared to have the cereal with the bowl, and I go into the fridge and I pick up the milk, and it's too light. There is no milk in the fridge. Life is unfair. Now, in that moment, I can either get very upset that there is no milk, or I can let it go. It's fine. We'll get milk another time. If it's early enough, I could go get milk myself. I only live 7 minutes from the grocery store. I know, that's stupid, but life is unfair. And we see in Joseph's life, we're going to continue to see his response to all of the unfair things that has happened to him. Spending time in prison, getting sold into slavery. Those are two major ones. 2 is probably a lot, right? Getting forgotten about in prison. Anyway, we're going to pick up in Genesis 50:14. It says this: After burying Jacob, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had accompanied him to his father's burial. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. See, here's the thing. Here's the thing with this scripture, okay? With this verse here, with Genesis 50:14 and 15, we've got the brothers who have had a guilty conscience since they threw Joseph in that cistern. Since they threw Joseph and sold him into slavery, they have had a guilty conscience. And so they've been living with this guilty conscience. They've been tiptoeing around. You know how you do this, as you tiptoe around with a guilty conscience. And what happens is guilty consciences project. Guilty consciences project. So in your life right now, if you look at what you have going on in your life, if you have a guilty conscience, it projects onto other people. They're afraid of other people. They were afraid of what Joseph was going to do to them now that their dad was dead. They still had this guilty conscience that they felt guilt all of the time, and they project it onto the people around them. They project it onto the person that they are guilty of doing something to. Right? You know you do this. If it's your boss at work, I'm not saying this has ever happened to me before, but just for instance, let's say, you know what, the day I got fired of a job. Yeah. Let's talk about that again real quick. As I've said before, I don't know if you've heard this story or not, but I'm building a prank. I'm not using company time wisely, and I get called into somebody's office, my boss's office, to have a little chat. Do you think my guilty conscience was going a mile a minute? You bet it was. You bet it was. I get caught doing something should probably not be doing. And my guilty conscience projects onto them. And I start freaking out. All of the what ifs start playing through your head. And if you have a guilty conscience, doesn't all of the what ifs start flooding your mind? If you've lied about something in the past to someone. Have you ever lied to someone? I bet you have, because you're a human being. I know that in times that I've lied to someone, which, shocker, I know I've lied probably more than I can count. But when I've lied to someone, what are we always afraid of? I'm always afraid that I'm going to get caught. I'm going to get caught in a lie. Guilty consciences project. Some guilty consciences project in a way that makes them violent and angry. Right? Some of us feel sheepish. That's a really difficult word to say. Some of us feel sheepish, so I said it again. Some of us feel concerned. Some of us are scared of our own tail. And manifests itself in a lot of different ways, doesn't it? It's like, oh gosh, I hope they don't ever find out about this. Other people get angry and indignant whenever they get questioned about something because they have a guilty conscience and they're projecting it onto other people, thinking that now they're the guilty ones. I'm not the guilty ones, you're the guilty ones. And we project it onto other people, and now they are getting upset with us, and then it escalates and it builds and it builds and it blows up. Guilty consciences project. Thankfully, though, we have a guy in Joseph who's more about making reparations, who's more about repairing the relationship, who's more about forgiveness than he is actually sending people into their doom. He could have sent the brothers to their doom at any time he wanted to. He was a very, very, very powerful man. But as Uncle Ben once said, with great power comes great responsibility. And Joseph had great power, and he had even greater responsibility. And he used it very, very, very well. He could have sent the brothers off. He recognized them right away. He could have said, sorry, we don't have any grain for you. Would he have been justified in that? Would he have been clear as far as the law is concerned if he had said to those brothers, sorry, but there's no grain for you? Sure. He could have easily said that, and he would have gotten vengeance. He would have gotten revenge on his brothers for all of the times that they ridiculed him and pushed him in the wrong direction. Joseph could have done that. He could have said, you know what, brothers? Guess what? He wouldn't have called them brothers because they didn't want him. He didn't want them to find out that they were his brothers. Did I say that right? Yeah. He could have done those things. And he would have gotten vengeance. But what does Joseph say? But Joseph replied. So the brothers came and asked him. They're like, I'm so sorry. We're indebted to you. We'll do anything you want us to do. We beg for your forgiveness. And it says, when Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. And they said, we'll be your slaves. And Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended, smell check. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. Here's something that Joseph understood and that I don't think, myself, have a hard time with, that I don't always understand. Because whenever I'm wronged, I want to take vengeance. I want to get revenge. I want to do the manly thing, right? I want to go in there and do something. In my brain, I would never actually do this, but in my brain, I'm a much bigger man than I actually am, and I'm like a superhero that can go on and take on a horde of evil people and just throw them all against a wall and I win. That's in my brain. That's what I would love to do. I'd love to get vengeance. Do you ever have those arguments in your head where somebody offends you? And then you start having this argument in your head where like, okay, they're going to say this, then I'm going to say this, and then they're going to say this, and then I'm going to trump them with this word, and it's going to win, and I'm going to be awesome, and people are going to put me on their shoulders, and we're going to have a parade, and no one will ever question me again. No, you don't ever do that? I do. I do all the time, actually. Because I don't always understand this point. I don't let the grace of God sink into my life. I don't let the forgiveness of Jesus Christ sink into my life. But thankfully, Joseph understands, and we have this example here. Because God's grace and forgiveness doesn't stop with me. The grace that I've received, the forgiveness that I've received by the mercy of God, by the grace of God, through the love of Jesus Christ. It doesn't end with me. It doesn't stop with me. God's grace does not stop with me. I'm not the last one to receive God's grace, and you are not the last one to receive God's grace and forgiveness. Last week we talked about grace and love. Grace and love. Hey, buddy. Last week we talked about grace and love. He must be really enjoying the message. He's down here. Last week we talked about grace and love, grace and love, grace and love. We ended it with grace and love. And we need to continue doing those things because God's grace and forgiveness doesn't stop with me. The person, the neighbor next to you needs to hear and see God's grace and forgiveness. Your coworkers need to see God's grace and forgiveness. Your spouse needs to see God's grace and forgiveness. Your children need to see God's grace and forgiveness. God's grace and forgiveness doesn't stop with me, but too many times I act like God's grace and forgiveness stopped with me. That there's going to be not enough. I don't know if you ever do this at the dinner table. I do this often. That's why I make so much food. Do you ever go to somebody's house and you see what's on the table and you start counting how many people are there? And you're like, there's not enough food here. What are we going to do here? Because there's not enough food. I am getting hungry, and we're a family of 6, okay? We brought all of our kids. I brought my wife with me. You're a family of 5. That meant, I don't know. I'm not pinpointing that on anyone. So there's 11 people. You made 8 hot dogs. There's not enough to go around there, pal. There's not enough hot dogs there, buckaroo. And what do you start doing? I know what I start doing. I start moving towards the front of the food line. I start moving over towards the counter where all the food is. I'm like, okay, you got a bag of chips. There's 8 hot dogs for 11 of us. There's some watermelon, and there's water. Cool. Nice barbecue, bro. I'm going to take what's mine because I'm a selfish person. Kids can have a half a hot dog today. It doesn't matter. I'm bigger and I'm larger and I need more food. Don't you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal. It's what goes through my head. So I hoard it all to myself. I make sure that I'm taken care of, and I don't care if anybody else is taken care of. I'm going to have that watermelon. I'm going to have the hot dog, and I'll drink the water. Because I'm important. See, we don't have to worry about that with God's grace and forgiveness. It's never going to run out. There's nothing that we can do. There's no ending supply of God's grace and forgiveness. So the good news is that the hot dogs are going to keep going on the grill. We have more than enough. You don't need to hoard it all for yourself. It doesn't stop with you. You spread it on to another person. You make sure other people are taken care of. You make sure that you've got your grace. You've got your forgiveness. That's awesome. Now who are you going to give it to? Who are you going to send it to next? It's a gift that gets to keep moving forward and keep spreading forward. And if we're going to be about anything Restoration Church, it's going to be about grace and forgiveness, grace and love. Remember that. So what does that look like in our lives? What does that look on social media to be able to say God's grace and forgiveness doesn't stop with me? How does it look when somebody posts on Facebook and you don't agree with it? How does God's grace and forgiveness not stopping with you, how is it presented to that person? How is it presented to the person on the other side of the political spectrum as you? God's grace and forgiveness doesn't stop with me in church. Restoration, listen, we have to be about this. It cannot end with us. The only way that people are going to see Jesus in our lives, the only way that people are going to see his resurrection power is through the grace and forgiveness that we offer to other people. I'm going to keep going, okay? Cool. All right. What I want to say, just real quick, is we have this whole idea, just real quick before we keep going, of this whole cancel culture, right? Everything's getting canceled. If you don't like something, you can hashtag cancel party is, or the over party is over for whoever it is, flavor of the day. We have this cancel culture where it's like, you know what? If I don't agree with that, if I don't like it, cancel it. If I don't like it, don't let me see it. Don't let me hear it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to see it. Canceled. If that's going to affect me in a way that I don't like, cancel it. I can't handle this because we're a very emotional person. We're not very emotionally healthy. We're not very spiritually healthy. And so in response, we can't see anything else because we don't know how to process it ourselves. Cancel culture is a byproduct of us not being spiritually and emotionally healthy. And for some of us, we went through a book called Spiritually and Emotional Health, Spiritually and whatever it was. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, that's what it was called. And we have this cancel culture that says, you know what, if you don't like it, make sure you get a boycott going for it. If you hate it, make sure that cancel culture exists. You get what you deserve, brother. Cancel culture. Let's see how that lines up with Scripture, shall we? Let's see how the cancel culture lines up with Scripture. Can we do that real quick? Cool. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to do that. Romans 12, starting in verse 14. I'm pretty sure we've read this before. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Okay. Pray that God will bless them. What? Be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. Well, that flies directly into the face of cancel culture, doesn't it? See, cancel culture thinks that I know it all. I know everything. I know every detail about every single story, so I can make a verdict. I can be the judge. I can be the jury, and I can be the executioner. That flies in the face of what the Bible says. God's grace and forgiveness doesn't end with me. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. I know we've gone through this scripture before. Dear friends, never take revenge. Joseph lived this. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. How many of us want to take revenge right now if we see something that we don't agree with? For the scripture says, I will take revenge. I will pay them back, says the Lord. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads. That's not to say that if you do all of these good things, if you treat people, if you treat your enemies with kindness, with humility, with love and affection and grace, what it means by you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads, they're not saying that this is going to hurt that person. They might be hurt by it, but not in a way. We don't do this to get revenge on them. See, this burning coals of shame on their heads means that they're going to feel the weight of the guilt if we respond with kindness. If you respond with anger, they're going to have anger. If you respond with resentment and anger and judgment, guess what? That's going to anger them even more. That's going to make them even more indignant and feel like they're justified in their actions. But if you can, and I'm talking to myself too, if we can repay with kindness, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. What would it look like? My wonderful friends, my dear friends, what would it look like? Think about whoever you are, okay? Let's just say that you are a conservative, Christian, white, straight man. Okay? I think I've hit pretty much all the boxes there for a human being. What would it look like if instead of humiliating the other side, hating the other people group, hating the other skin color, resenting the other sexual orientation, what if you fed them? What if you gave them something to drink? What if you sat down with someone who is gay What if you sat down with someone who was on the other side of the party? What if you sat down, and I'm not saying that these are enemies, okay? But in your mind, as you're thinking through this, who are the enemies in your life? We think about, oh, well, ISIS, yeah, sure. Let's go have a lunch with them. I'll do that. Yeah, for sure. But no, let's talk about the people in your community. Who are the people in your community right now that you're thinking of that you cannot stand, that you don't share an opinion with? Who are those people that you can have a meal with? Ooh, it gets much more personal then, doesn't it? When we specify a single person that we know of, who is that person that's across the aisle? Who is that person that doesn't have the same belief system with you? Who is that coworker that goes on rants about being anti-Christian and all of these other things? What does it look like if you go out and have a meal with that person? If you spend time with that person, getting to know that person? Holy cow. In fact, church, I'm going to dare you this week. I know restaurants are opening up, so I think it's okay. I'm going to dare you this week to find a person who you do not agree with, that you would consider an enemy. This could be a person that you don't agree with. Now, I hope you don't hear me say that these people are enemies, because what I'm saying is that the people in your mind that you consider to be enemies, and I'm going to do the same thing with someone that I might consider to be an enemy of mine, someone that I don't agree with. What would it look like if in the next week we decided to listen? It says, don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. And that's our point. Conquer evil with good. See, what Joseph encountered in his life, he conquered that evil with good. And God saw all of Joseph's life and says, I'm going to do this in your life. I'm going to do this in your life. And I'm going to do this in your life. And you are going to be my example of what true grace and forgiveness looks like until Jesus. See, Joseph made a huge impact on Egypt by living this way, by having grace and forgiveness for people around him and leading well. And sitting across from the table from people, I only imagine. But if you want to know that you're having a mark of a Christian, if you have the mark of a Christian and you are showing grace and forgiveness to people, it's going to play out in the community around you. One of my favorite stories is of a friend of mine who was a pastor in southern Michigan, and he moved to California. And when he moved to California, the community, not his church, the community around him threw him a big old going away party. Not because they were happy he was leaving. They were very sad that he was leaving their community because he had made such an impact on this community, because he was living outside of the walls of the church, showing grace and forgiveness and having conversations, having meals with people that he didn't always understand or even necessarily agree with. Joseph made an impact in Egypt. The Egyptians mourned for 70 days. Typically you mourn for 40 days. They mourned for 70 days at Jacob's passing. And then a whole group of them went with Joseph to bury Jacob back in Canaan. And then they had this memorial, and they mourned for another 7 days. High-ranking officials in the Egyptian government. Because that's how Joseph lived his life, and that's how he responded to things that were unjust and unfair. See, friends, Jesus has and continues to finish it. You don't have to fight the battle anymore. You don't have to stand up for whatever you think. I probably said that wrong. Now, listen to me. Jesus has and continues to finish it. what I just said, if you don't need to stand for what you think, what I'm saying is that Jesus has already won. Our job is to show grace and forgiveness. And I'm not saying don't stand up for what you believe in. Don't stand for truth. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, remember, you're not the one who's winning the battle. Jesus has and continues to finish it. In my own life, Jesus has and continues to finish it. Jesus on the cross said, "It is finished." What that means, that word, tetelestai, means that it has been finished. It will be finished. And it is finished. I said that kind of weird. It has been finished, it is finished, and it continues to be finished. It's an ongoing, it's a perfect tense, meaning that what has been done is being done and will be done. So the question for you is, what do you need to let go of? Last week we talked about showing grace and love, grace and love, grace and love. And this week, I ask you, what do you need to let go of? We're going to leave it open-ended there because we're out of time. But with that question, what do you need to let go of? Spend some time, if you can, in prayer. In these next few moments, we're going to close this video out, but you're still going to be where you're at. Don't go on to the next thing. Don't immediately go to the next video that's playing. Don't immediately do whatever the next thing on your agenda is. Spend some time in prayer and saying, what do I need to let go of? And I'll do the same thing. Friends, thank you so much for listening and watching. Be sure to check us out again. We'll be here tomorrow to let you know about the news that we have coming on. What do I need to let go of? Take care.